Good evening, great to be back after a few weeks off on a very busy news day. We are speaking to Shadow Treasurer Jim Chalmers in just a moment to discuss a fair few issues in an unedited and uncensored interview. But first tonight, the Novak Djokovic drama is right now deepening. Lawyers representing the embattled tennis star revealed late yesterday that he'd tested positive to COVID on December 16. Now, he used that prior infection to argue he should be exempt from Australia's vaccine travel requirement, even when the cut-off date for an exemption application was nearly a week before he tested positive. The exemption request was late, and the Health Department says prior infection does not provide reasonable grounds for an exemption, but the government granted him a temporary visa on December 30 anyway. On New Year's Day, the Home Affairs Department also made clear Djokovic had met all the requirements for travel before they abruptly cancelled his visa on arrival. That's when, it's alleged, government officials didn't give Djokovic an adequate chance to liaise with his lawyers or rest after 25 hours of travel. The fiasco is still unfolding and will reach match point tomorrow when the world number one will have his case heard in the federal court. Chief Reporter Connor Albanese has more.
Novak Djokovic, confused.
Was granted a controversial medical exemption to play.
His COVID vaccine exemption has been denied.
Privileged.
People are just sick of superstars being given special treatment.
Or persecuted.
Do you agree that it is political persecution?
I can't really see anything else.
Inside this nondescript building in Melbourne, 33 migrants and one world number one tennis superstar. For a third night, Djokovic is holed up in an immigration detention hotel just minutes from the grounds of the Australian Open. Win the tournament this year and he will break the Grand Slam record. It begins Monday week. Players must be vaccinated. Djokovic refuses. But natural immunity was enough for the Victorian government to grant the tennis star an exemption. Issued a visa by the federal government and granted permission to play by the state government, Djokovic was allowed to board the plane unvaccinated. But upon landing, the federal government decided they wouldn't let him past the airport. Authorities cancelled his visa after 8 hours of interrogation. Djokovic now faces deportation.
Rules are rules, and there are no special cases.
Rules that have been judged draconian by protesters in Serbia and Melbourne. Fans, anti-vaxxers and refugee supporters united not by a political ideology, but a rallying call for his release.
I Novaka pokušavaju na isti način da razapinju.
Serbia now locked in an intense match of diplomatic tennis with Australia, demanding Djokovic is moved to accommodation befitting the best sportsman on the planet. The tennis star has reportedly demanded access to a chef and a tennis court. Piers Morgan weighing in, it is not about whether you believe in COVID vaccines, but whether you believe famous sports stars should play by the same rules as everyone else, he wrote. Senator Sarah Hanson-Young turning attention to the refugees housed in the same building as Djokovic. Some have been there for 9 years, still awaiting their own court hearings. Imagine if compassion and outrage was consistent. For Djokovic, tomorrow is D-Day. The star's legal team is set to challenge his visa cancellation in the federal court. But with the legal challenge ongoing, there remains a chance the world's number one will be permitted to play in what has become one monumental tennis racket with Australia centre court. Connor Albanese, 6 News.
Now, Jim Chalmers is the federal shadow treasurer. He's in Brisbane right now, and earlier I caught up with him from the newsroom to discuss Novak Djokovic, rapid antigen tests, the upcoming federal election, and plenty more, giving him the tough questions, but also giving him the chance to answer without interruptions or editing. Take a look. Jim Chalmers, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on your show, Leo.
Good to have you here. So obviously the big story right now is Novak Djokovic. We are expecting further developments on that sometime on Monday. But, you know, Scott Morrison, obviously, he said in that Thursday press conference he didn't have a valid medical exemption. You've got the Victorian state government saying they didn't issue the visa. What do you make of all this? Should he be sent back, or do we let him play?
I think, first of all, if he doesn't comply with the rules and regulations, then he shouldn't be here. You know, there shouldn't be one set of rules for a celebrity and another set of rules for everybody else. I think that that's self-evident, and this process that's underway will help determine what the story is there. I think Australians are a bit sceptical about the Prime Minister's role in this, not just that we've had the usual, blame shift. First it was the Victorians, then it was Tennis Australia, everybody else's fault, and then he saw a political angle in it. And so now we get all this chest beating because he's hoping that Australians won't focus on the fact that he stuffed up the rapid antigen tests, he stuffed up the booster rollout so far. There aren't enough groceries on the shelves in supermarkets, and he's hoping that people focus on Novak Djokovic and not on the government's failures. But I think more Australians care about the shortage of tests and groceries and boosters. They care more about what's happening in our schools and childcare centres than they care about whether or not Novak plays.
And I'll get to the testing situation and the vaccines in a moment. But, 6 News, we've been speaking to people throughout this pandemic who are Australians or Australian citizens who have not been able to come back. And you see it on social media almost daily. They're fully vaccinated, some of which boosted. And they haven't been able to come into Australia. But obviously, Novak Djokovic has. Would Labor, if you guys did win government, and that could be as soon as March, would you be trying to prioritise the Australian citizens rather than the celebrities and the sports stars when it comes to people actually getting into Australia?
I think two things about that. First of all, as I said, we need to make sure that there's faith in the system, and faith in the system comes from ensuring that there isn't one set of rules for the best tennis player in the world and another set of rules for everybody else. So that would be an important principle that would guide us. And I think, secondly, we've said for some time there are issues with people who are stranded overseas. There are tens of thousands of people who've been in that position over the last couple of years. And so we've been critical of the government and the way that they've managed that. But if we need to have robust rules, we need to see them fairly applied, and we need to make sure that people can come home safely.
Yeah, now there have been calls, coming back to the vaccine rollout now, there have been calls from some to, delay the return to school for primary school students in an attempt to get them vaccinated. That obviously starts very, very soon for 5 to 11-year-olds. Is that something you'd support, you'd want to see in an attempt to get these kids vaccinated?
If it's consistent with the health advice, I'm a parent of young kids myself. I've got 2 kids going into primary school this month here in Brisbane. And it's a very anxious time for parents. Parents are worried about getting their kids vaccinated and also the return to school. So the premiers and hopefully the federal government is taking the best available health advice on that and coming to a reasonable decision on it. I think people will understand and accept a decision if it's based on the right advice and made for the right reasons. But there's a lot of anxiety amongst parents of school-aged kids, and I think that's understandable.
Now, these long testing lines, whether that's for PCR or whether it's people trying to get rapid antigen tests, have just continued, and they're still continuing. Who should take responsibility for this? Is this something the federal government needs to take responsibility for, or is this something that falls onto the states?
Scott Morrison needs to take responsibility for this. The reason we've got this absolute debacle when it comes to testing is because Scott Morrison, once again, hasn't done his job, hasn't taken responsibility. He's always taking credit when things go well, but when things go bad, as they have been going diabolically bad in testing, then he's nowhere to be found. It's his responsibility to sort out supply. It's his responsibility to make sure that the tests are available freely. And instead, he's done the usual kind of buck passing. We've had Australians waiting in line for 8 or 9 hours. We've had people fainting while they're waiting queues. We've had people driving around while they're at their most vulnerable and their most contagious, from chemist to chemist and supermarket to supermarket, trying to get tests. And if they can find any, they're typically unaffordable because the price has been skyrocketing. So the best way through this, and we've made a constructive suggestion in the course of the last week, which is the rapid antigen test should be free. That's the right thing to do, but it's also good economic policy when you consider the rapid tests when you buy them in bulk are about $3 or $4 a pop, whereas the PCR tests, which people have been getting for free, cost the government $100 a pop. And that's before you factor in all of the economic carnage that's come from this stuff up on rapid testing. There's some really important research out there by Flinders University in the last few days, which shows that the cost to government of supplying rapid tests for free is absolutely dwarfed by the cost to the economy of not supplying them for free. So it's good economic policy to do the right thing and provide these tests. That will take some of the pressure off the queues, which have been unacceptably long.
So you're calling for them to be free for all, and we know that the Prime Minister announced it for certain concessional card holders, but obviously that is not everyone. There are still millions of people who could not get it free. Why then did, Labor and even more specifically Anthony Albanese, I think you were saying you want them to be affordable, but I don't think you were initially saying you wanted them to become free. Why did it take, a day to just say blanket it should be free?
Well, we considered all of the options, Leo, as you'd expect from an alternative government. We want to make sure that the proposals that we're putting forward are responsible. And the landing point that we reached is entirely consistent with what we've been saying for some weeks now, which is that nobody should be denied a test on the basis of not being able to afford one. The best way to ensure that, the fairest, most responsible, most efficient way to ensure that is to provide these tests free of charge via the Medicare system. It's good for the person who needs that test to prevent them going from chemist to chemist and supermarket to supermarket paying $60 and $70 and $80 a throw. But it's also good for the economy and the broader community so that people can afford to do the right thing by their co-workers and their loved ones to get a test, and if they've got COVID, to take the appropriate steps.
Do you think your initial messaging around rats was confusing or conflicting? You are saying, as I should repeat, you are saying now free for all, but you weren't initially. Do you think that could have confused some people?
I don't think so, Leo. I've seen that kind of commentary on social media as you have, but the position that we came to is entirely consistent with what we've been saying for some time. We want to provide those tests for free. That's the most responsible and fairest way to do it. It's good for people to receive those tests, but it's also good for the economy. And so that's why we came to that position. And I don't think it matters whether we take, that we took another day to come to that conclusion when it's entirely consistent with what we've been saying for a long time.
And Labor could be the next federal government as soon as March. March or May is when we're likely to see the election. Can I just confirm, if you were in government in March, would you be making rats free for all? Or is that something you're just telling the federal government to do now, the current federal government, and would not implement by March, when we could have a very different COVID situation? It is, changing rapidly. But Labor and government in March, let's pretend that's happening. Would rats be free for all?
Well, first things first, Leo, as Anthony Albanese said, this is a problem that can't actually wait for a change of government. This is a problem that's with us here and now. It's a problem that only a government which is in government in January can solve. So we've made that clear. Now, obviously, if there is still a need, if and when we come to government, where the position that we're coming from on this. But this is a problem that can't wait for a change. It's a problem that exists right now in January, and it will exist until the government fixes it. It's for the Morrison government to fix it in the first instance, and so we're calling on the government to do it.
Are you confident in your chances getting into government, whenever that may be, March or May? We've been talking, throughout the past 2 years about so-called pandemic governments and pandemic elections, and how, at least in Australia, every state and territory that has had an election since the pandemic begun, the government that was in power retained power and was re-elected. Is that something that, could possibly come into effect federally? But yeah, are you confident that Labor will win?
Well, I think that reason that you just identified is the reason why we're not complacent or take for granted the outcome of this election. There are still benefits to being the incumbent, even an incumbent which is getting things so diabolically wrong as this government is. And also, as you know, with your history of watching elections, the last election didn't go the way that the pundits expected. So we don't take a single vote for granted. You know, as we speak, Anthony Albanese is on an 8-day tour through regional Queensland, and I'll be joining him on that tour. And that's because we will go to every corner of Australia and make sure that we earn the support of the Australian people, and we are able to tell them all about a better future that they can enjoy under a Labor government, which is all about support for working families and more secure and better paid jobs and a future made in Australia. And the election will be about our vision for the future versus the monumental debacle that we've seen under this Prime Minister, who won't take responsibility for the economic consequences and the health consequences of his mismanagement of this pandemic.
Just finally, your Labor, as I said, you haven't been in government since 2013, which was a while back. For a bit of perspective, that was the first year I was starting primary school. So it's been a while since then. Anthony Albanese is the current leader. There's always talks on social media about who's going to take the opposition to the next election. Can I just confirm, are you confident in Anthony Albanese's leadership, and are you, happy to see him take Labor to the next federal election just finally?
100%. And I want to be a treasurer in an Anthony Albanese-led Labor government. All of the colleagues are united, unlike the other side. We want to make Anthony the Prime Minister, not just for its own sake, but because of all the good that we can do for the people that we seek to represent.
All right, Shadow Treasurer Jim Chalmers, thanks very much for taking the time, and hopefully we can catch up a bit later and a bit closer to the federal election.
Look forward to it, Leo. Much appreciated.
Jim Chalmers there. Now, we'd love to hear your thoughts on what he had to say and the interview in general, so comment below or share the link to this video on social media. Use the hashtag 6newsau or email your feedback to contact@6newsau.com. Meanwhile, thousands of Victorians who are waiting for results after taking a PCR test have been told their samples were invalid. The Herald Sun reports that the text from Melbourne Pathology stated that, quote, your COVID sample is no longer suitable to be tested and no result can be provided if currently symptomatic. Assume you are positive and arrange a rapid antigen or repeat a PCR swab confirmation as soon as possible. The paper also reported that the messages were being received by people who have waited a week or longer for their results. Even with these long lines for PCR tests and a shortage of rapid antigen test, cases have jumped in recent days across the state and across the country. Premier Dan Andrews will now return from leave. He had attended national cabinet meetings. Victoria today recorded 44,155 new cases. That is down from yesterday's amount of more than 50,000, though it should be pointed out that most people who reported a positive rapid antigen tests that were counted in yesterday's numbers got that result earlier in the week. 752 people are now in hospital, 104 in ICU, 23 on ventilators and 4 deaths. One thing to note is that of those cases, 22,051 were from a RAT and 22,104 from a PCR test. So that is pretty close to a 50-50 split, with an exact difference of just 53. In New South Wales, meanwhile, 30,062 new cases, 1,927 people in hospital, 151 in ICU and 16 deaths. That is a record. Other states and territories also all recording sharp rises other than WA, of course. From midday yesterday, dancing became banned at licensed venues in the ACT. Patrons must now be seated while eating and drinking, with mandatory face mask rules in some settings also continuing. Overseas now, a national day of mourning will be held in Kazakhstan tomorrow amid ongoing unrest that some have described as the worst in more than 30 years. The country's former intelligence chief, Naram Masimov, who was the head of the National Security Committee, has now been arrested on suspicion of treason. Kazakhstan's president says he has ordered security forces to fire without warning. According to the BBC, he also claimed that 20,000 bandits had attacked the main city of Almaty, which is where the centre of protests is, that was sparked by that fuel price hike. Changing pace completely now, let's check in with tomorrow's forecast right across the country. Partly cloudy, 29 degrees in Brisbane, rain at 27 in Sydney, also 27 in Canberra. In Melbourne, partly cloudy, you guessed it, 27. A chance of showers, 17 in Hobart, 36 and sunny in Adelaide, 42 in Alice Springs, 29 in Perth, and in Darwin, a warm top of 33. And just before we go today, make sure you visit our website 6newsau.com because we've just updated a few sections. Now, if you click or hover your mouse over the the latest headline section, you'll see two new sections: COVID-19 and Australia Decides. Now, the first is pretty self-explanatory, but the second is for our federal election coverage. We'll also be adding sections for the SA and Victorian elections pretty soon, and in addition to our existing fact check section, we'll now have video editions of fact check available on our YouTube channel. That's starting this Thursday. Make sure you subscribed and clicked all notifications so you don't miss it. And that is 6 News for this Sunday evening. You can stay up to date with the latest headlines by heading to our website 6newsau.com and by following us on social media: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok and Lid. Just search 6 News AU to find us. Good to be back this Sunday. I'm Leonardo Puglisi. Thanks so much for your company. Have a great night.